Steve Robertson didn't believe in distractions. Not family, not love, not children tugging at his sleeve, or a wife waiting at home. He believed in control, in discipline, in building an empire brick by unshakable brick. But power always comes with conditions, and one condition in particular had left him pacing his glass-walled office with a storm in his chest. Mr. Harrington, the investor, a man who controlled billions, who could turn empires into dust or raise them higher than the clouds. Harrington was ready to sign the deal, but not with just any man. Trust, Harrington had said, was the deciding factor, and trust to Harrington meant stability, family, roots, a wife to show loyalty, and maybe even a child to prove legacy. And just a few hours ago, his personal assistant, Richard, a loyal man with more patience than most, had stood across the desk, shifting nervously with a folder in his hand. "Mr. Robertson," he began carefully, "I've been reviewing the investor's profile again. Mr. Harrington, he's refused partnerships with anyone who doesn't reflect those values." Steve leaned back in his leather chair, eyes narrowing. "And your point, Richard?" Richard swallowed, then pressed forward. "Sir, if we want this deal, you need to act fast. Harrington won't invest a dime in a man who comes across as detached. He believes a man who can't manage a family can't be trusted to manage an empire." The silence in the room was heavy. Steve's jaw tightened. "So what do you suggest? That I suddenly produce a wife out of thin air?" Richard exhaled slowly. Yes, maybe for a short period. Just for a week if you want." He opened the folder, sliding a sheet forward. "We draw up a contract, find someone who can play the role. A temporary arrangement, nothing more. You get your investment, and when the deal is signed, she disappears." Steve gave a sharp, humorless laugh. "Hire me a wife. That's absurd." But then, his calculating mind began to turn. If Harrington demanded the facade of family, then family he would have, even if it meant staging one. His lips curved into a thin, dangerous smile. "Do it. Hire me a wife. But make sure she is worth it." And with that, the first stone was laid in a path that neither man realized would change everything. And now, Steve Robertson, billionaire, ruthless negotiator, a man who carved empires with steel and will, found himself waiting for a stranger, a woman who would pretend to be his wife. The office door opened, and she walked in, Karen Anders. She was nothing like the polished socialite Steve expected. Her dress was plain, a soft fabric that clung but didn't boast. Her shoes were scuffed, but she carried herself with quiet dignity, her chin lifted, her shoulders straight. Steve's sharp gaze swept over her, calculating, dissecting. He expected nerves, but her eyes, steady and brown, framed by long lashes, met his without flinching. "You signed the contract?" Steve's voice was clipped, testing. "Yes," she said evenly. Her heart thundered, but she didn't show it, because the moment she saw him, recognition struck like lightning. It was him, the man from that night years ago, the man whose name she never knew, whose face haunted her dreams, whose absence became her son's truth. But Steve's expression didn't flicker, not a hint of recognition. Of course not. He'd been drunk that night, lost in a haze. She had been desperate, foolish, and invisible to him. And now, standing here in his office, she realized the cruel irony. He had forgotten her, but she could never forget him. Karen steadied her voice. I should be clear before we begin. Steve's brow arched. Clear about what? I have one condition. His eyes narrowed. Condition? I come with my son, she said firmly. But Steve wanted to object, but she continued. I won't leave him behind. Besides, she added, meeting his gaze with surprising boldness, a wife with a child will make this whole thing more convincing. Silence fell like a blade between them. Steve's jaw tightened. His stomach churned with irritation. He had asked for a wife, not a family. A child was messy, loud, unpredictable. He had no patience for them. Richard cleared his throat quietly in the corner. The reminder was unspoken but sharp. Harrington valued family. The image had to be believable. Steve leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. His gaze bore into hers. Fine, bring the boy. But he better behave. Karen gave a curt nod. She didn't thank him, didn't smile. She just turned, her spine straight, her head high. And for the first time in years, Steve Robertson, master of every deal, every room, every person he encountered, felt a ripple of something he couldn't name. Unsettled. Later in the evening, in her modest apartment across town, Karen sat on the edge of her son's bed. Brian, 6 years old, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes too bright for his age, clutched a worn stuffed bear to his chest. His legs swung excitedly over the edge of the bed as he peppered his mother with questions. So we're really moving into a mansion, Mom? With marble floors and shiny cars, and maybe even a swimming pool? Karen smiled softly, brushing a curl from his forehead. Yes, sweetheart. Just for a week. Brian's eyes lit up. And we have to pretend you're his wife? Her chest tightened, but she nodded. Yes, that's the job. And I'm his son? Brian asked, grinning as if it were the grandest game in the world. Karen forced a laugh, though her heart ached. Yes, baby. For 1 week. That's the role we play. Brian tilted his head, his voice softening. But couldn't he be my real dad instead of just hiring us? The question sliced through her. She kissed his forehead quickly, masking the ache in her chest with a playful tone. You ask too many questions. Now lie down and sleep. He giggled, curling into his blanket. All right, Mom, but I think I'd like him as my dad. Her smile faltered when his eyes closed. Because Brian didn't know. He didn't know who the man he would soon call pretend dad was. That night, as the city glittered outside the window, Karen packed their few belongings into a worn suitcase. For her, this wasn't just a job. It was survival. A chance to give her son more than empty cupboards and overdue rent. But for Steve Robertson, this arrangement was something else entirely, because for the first time in his carefully controlled life, he had agreed to something that wasn't clean, simple, or calculated. He had agreed to bring not just a wife into his home, but a child, a boy who would unknowingly challenge everything Steve thought he believed about family, and a woman whose presence stirred a past he didn't even remember. The week hadn't even begun, and already, the game was changing. The Harrington Mansion dinner was set for Friday. That gave Steve only 5 days. 5 days to turn a stranger into a convincing wife. 5 days to adjust to a boy he never wanted under his roof. And 5 days to convince the most powerful investor he had ever met that Steve Robertson was not only a ruthless businessman, but also a loyal husband and devoted father. Steve hated wasting time, so the moment Karen and Brian stepped into his penthouse, the rules began. First, Steve said curtly, his voice echoing against marble floors and glass walls. "You'll keep to appearances. Publicly, you'll behave like my wife." Affection, smiles. Whatever Harrington expects to see. Karen crossed her arms, her suitcase at her side. Understood. His eyes flicked to Brian, who was already darting toward the enormous staircase, his small sneakers squeaking against polished stone. Steve's jaw clenched. "And he—" "Brian," Karen interrupted, her tone protective, "is part of the deal. He's not invisible." Steve's gaze sharpened. He wasn't used to being interrupted, but the quiet fire in her voice stopped him from retorting. Instead, he exhaled sharply. "Fine, but keep him out of my way." Brian, oblivious to the tension, gasped as he reached the top of the staircase. "Mom, there's a whole second floor, and a giant window, and whoa, is that a pool?" Karen's lips curved despite herself. She hadn't seen Brian this excited in months. Steve followed her gaze for a second too long before forcing himself to look away. "Show him where he'll sleep. We start tomorrow." The next morning, the training began. To Steve, it was strategy, rehearsed greetings, timed handholds, practiced smiles. But to Karen, it was suffocating. He treated her like a pawn, a player in his grand scheme. And yet, every now and then, she caught glimpses of something different. When Brian spilled juice across the pristine breakfast table, Steve's first reaction was a flash of irritation. But instead of yelling, he paused. His jaw worked, his eyes cold. Then he simply pushed his plate aside and reached for a napkin. Brian blinked up at him. "You're not mad." Steve's tone was clipped. "Accidents happen. Just don't make it a habit." Brian grinned, showing a missing tooth. "Thanks, Dad." The word hit Steve like a slap. He stiffened, his hand freezing mid-wipe. His gaze flicked to Karen. Her breath caught. She hadn't told Brian to say that. Steve set the napkin down, straightened, and cleared his throat. "Don't call me that." Brian's face fell. "Oh, sorry, Mr. Robertson." For the rest of breakfast, Steve didn't look at either of them. Later, in the living room, Steve outlined the Harrington family's expectations. He spoke like a man preparing for war. Every word precise, every gesture controlled. "You'll sit to my left. Smile when I speak. Speak when spoken to. Harrington's wife values warmth, so pretend you admire me." Karen lifted a brow. "Pretend." His eyes narrowed. "That's what you're here for, isn't it?" Her lips tightened, but she said nothing. Brian, sitting cross-legged on the rug with his toy cars, piped up innocently. "You two fight like real married people already." Steve froze. Karen blinked. Then, for the briefest second, a flicker of amusement touched Steve's lips before it vanished. "Keep playing, kid." But Karen saw it. That crack in his armor. That glimpse of a man who wasn't all ice and steel. Over the next few days, the arrangement blurred. Steve remained the same in business. Ruthless, efficient, untouchable. But at home, things shifted in ways he didn't plan. He found himself listening for Brian's laughter down the hall. Found himself noticing the way Karen hummed softly while cooking, her voice low and soothing. Once late at night, Steve walked past the guest room and paused at the door. Inside, Brian slept sprawled across the bed, his stuffed bear clutched tightly. Karen sat beside him, a book in her lap, her face softened by the lamplight. For a moment, Steve simply watched. It was a dangerous thing, watching, because it made him feel. And Steve Robertson did not allow feelings to interfere with deals. By Thursday, Harrington's dinner loomed. The penthouse had been transformed. Polished silver, crystal glasses, every detail immaculate. Steve rehearsed every possible scenario, every potential conversation. He would not fail, but nothing in his plan accounted for what happened that afternoon. It began on the garden terrace. Steve had stepped outside to take a call when he overheard voices. Karen and Brian. "Mom," Brian whispered, his tone worried. "What if I mess up? What if I say the wrong thing at dinner?" "You won't," Karen soothed, stroking his hair. "Just be yourself." "But Mr. Robertson doesn't like me," Brian said quietly. "I can tell." The words pierced Steve deeper than he expected. Karen hesitated, then sighed. "He's not used to children, that's all. He's complicated." Brian pouted. "I just wanted him to like me." Steve's hand tightened around his phone. For a man who controlled every deal, every room, he had no idea how to control this, a boy's disappointment. And at that moment, Steve Robertson felt powerless. That evening, something changed. Brian wandered into Steve's study, clutching his bear, his eyes wide. "Mr. Robertson?" he asked softly. Steve looked up from his desk. "What is it? Can you help me tie this?" Brian held up a crooked bow tie, his small fingers fumbling with the fabric. Steve froze. He had never tied a bow tie for anyone but himself. But the boy's hopeful eyes left him no choice. Wordlessly, Steve set aside his papers, knelt, and adjusted the bow tie. His fingers worked carefully, slowly. Brian giggled when Steve muttered under his breath about the difficulty. "There," Steve said at last, tightening the knot. "Try not to ruin it in 5 minutes." Brian beamed. "Thanks, Dad." This time, Steve didn't correct him. Friday arrived. The dinner with Harrington was flawless. Steve played his role with precision, but the difference was Karen. She didn't just play her part, she lived it. Her smiles were genuine. Her laughter flowed like music. And Brian, wide-eyed, polite, endlessly curious, charmed Harrington's wife so completely that by dessert she declared, "Your family is just darling, Mr. Robertson. You're lucky to have them." For once, Steve didn't correct her. He glanced at Karen, their eyes meeting across the table. Something unspoken passed between them. Something neither could deny. But beneath the surface, tension burned. Because for Karen, every moment beside Steve was a reminder of the secret she carried. And for Steve, every smile, every touch, every accidental moment of warmth was a threat to the walls he had spent a lifetime building. The deal was almost secure, but the real danger was how real this pretend family was beginning to feel. The Harrington Investor Gala was no ordinary dinner. It was the kind of event where deals worth billions shifted hands over a glass of champagne, where reputations were built or destroyed in the span of a single evening, where one misstep could undo years of calculated strategy. Steve Robertson knew this better than anyone. He had prepared for every angle, every question Harrington or his board might ask. His pitch was airtight, his numbers flawless. But tonight, none of that mattered if one thing slipped: the illusion of family. And that illusion rested on Karen and Brian. The gala hall glittered with gold and crystal. Chatter rose like a hum beneath the grand chandeliers. Cameramen snapped photos at the entrance, eager to capture the arrivals of the city's most powerful. When Steve arrived, all eyes turned. But for once, it wasn't just him they looked at. At his side stood Karen, radiant in a midnight blue gown that hugged her figure without trying too hard. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, her smile soft but steady. And then there was Brian, in a crisp little suit, bow tie neatly tied, his eyes wide with awe at the towering ceilings and glittering lights. Together, they looked like a family, exactly what Harrington expected to see. Exactly what Steve needed. Inside, the evening began smoothly. Harrington greeted Steve with a booming laugh, clapping him on the shoulder. "Robertson, and this must be the wife and boy I've heard whispers about. Fine family you've got here." Steve nodded, his smile easy, confident. "Thank you. They mean everything to me." The words rolled off his tongue as though rehearsed. But as Karen glanced at him, her chest tightened. He said it so convincingly. She almost believed him. Dinner began. Conversations flowed. Investors circled, eager to exchange pleasantries with the man of the hour. For a time, everything went exactly according to plan, until Daniel struck. Daniel Trent, Steve's longtime rival, had been waiting for this. He arrived with a woman clinging to his arm, Veronica, Steve's former lover. Her smile was sharp, predatory, as her eyes darted to Karen. Daniel waited until the room had quieted during the main course. His voice rang out, loud enough for every table to hear. "Strange, isn't it?" He leaned back in his chair, smirking. A man like Steve Robertson, a billionaire of his stature, suddenly produces a wife and child no one has ever seen before. The air shifted. Whispers rippled across the hall. Forks paused mid-bite. Harrington's brow furrowed, his gaze flicking between Steve and Karen. Karen froze, her heart pounding. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her. Brian fidgeted nervously in his chair, shrinking beside her. But Steve rose calmly, as though he had expected this moment all along. He didn't rush. He didn't stumble. He moved with deliberate slowness, reaching for Karen's hand and guiding her to her feet. The room fell into silence. His voice carried with authority. "For years, I've kept my family away from the public eye to protect them. Privacy has always mattered to me more than spectacle." His eyes swept across the room, sharp and unyielding. "But tonight, since questions have been raised, allow me to set the record straight. This," he pulled Karen closer, his hand firm at her waist, "this is my wife. And this," he turned to Brian, resting a hand gently on the boy's small shoulder, "is my son. The reason I have everything to fight for." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Harrington's frown smoothed into a smile of approval. Even the investors who had whispered leaned back, nodding thoughtfully. Daniel's smirk faltered. Veronica's eyes narrowed. And before anyone could react further, Steve sealed it. He lowered his head and captured Karen's lips in a deep, passionate kiss. The room erupted. Some clapped politely, others whispered furiously, but all eyes stayed fixed on the couple. Karen's breath caught. She hadn't expected it. The warmth of his mouth, the firmness of his hold. This wasn't rehearsed. This wasn't in the contract. Her heart raced wildly, not just from shock, but from the way he looked at her as he pulled back, as if it wasn't an act. Then, with stunning gentleness, Steve bent to kiss Brian's head, his hand still protective on the boy's shoulder. Brian blinked up at him, eyes wide. For once, he didn't look afraid of Steve. He looked proud. The gala hall buzzed with approval. Harrington clapped his hands together. "Magnificent. Truly magnificent. Robertson, you've built not just an empire, but a family worth admiring." Steve inclined his head, his expression unreadable. But inside, something burned hotter than victory. Later that evening, after the guests dispersed and the applause faded, Karen cornered Steve in the car. Her voice was fierce, trembling with suppressed emotion. "That was too extreme, Steve." He turned his head, his profile sharp against the city lights outside the window. "Was it? You kissed me, in front of everyone. That wasn't part of the agreement." He glanced at her then, his eyes calm, infuriatingly unreadable. Neither was letting Daniel humiliate us. I did what was necessary. Her chest tightened. Necessary? A faint smirk touched his lips, though his gaze didn't waver. If you think so. The words left her reeling. Was he teasing her, or was there something more behind that kiss? She didn't know, and that terrified her, because for one terrifying moment, she had kissed him back. That night, long after Brian had fallen asleep, Karen lay awake in the guest room. Her lips still tingled. Her heart still pounded. She told herself it was just part of the charade. Just another move in Steve's ruthless game. But deep down, she knew the truth. The way he had looked at her. Steady, unwavering, as though she wasn't just a piece in his plan. That wasn't something you could fake. And it left her with a question she couldn't escape. Did Steve Robertson, the man who had built walls of steel around his heart, somehow mean it? Or was she foolish for even daring to hope? In the quiet darkness of his own room, Steve stared out the window. The city sprawled beneath him. He told himself it had been strategy, a bold move to silence his enemies, to win Harrington's favor once and for all. But his lips still burned with the memory of hers. His chest still ached at the way Brian had looked at him. With pride, with trust. Dangerous feelings. Uncontrolled. Unplanned. And yet, for the first time in years, Steve Robertson wondered if maybe control wasn't everything. Maybe, just maybe, some risks were worth taking. Steve Robertson had won. Harrington's investment was his. The gala had crowned him the man with everything. Wealth, power, and now, apparently, a family. By every measure of success, this week-long charade had served its purpose. Which was why Karen packed in silence. In the guest room of Steve's mansion, she folded Brian's tiny shirts, tucked his shoes into the worn backpack he adored, and forced a smile whenever he looked her way. He was excited, chattering about chandeliers and marble staircases, but Karen's heart clenched tighter with every word. This was always temporary. Just 7 days. She had told herself that from the beginning. A paycheck, a role, nothing more. And yet, when she paused and looked around the room, the plush bedding her son had slept in without fear, the toys Steve's PA had hurriedly purchased to make Brian feel welcome, the faint trace of laughter that had echoed through these sterile halls, she felt something she hadn't dared in years. It felt like home. "Mom," Brian whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "Do we really have to go? Can't we stay here a little longer?" Her throat tightened. She smoothed his hair and kissed his forehead. "Sweetheart, this isn't our house. We don't belong here." But when she turned, she nearly stumbled. Steve was standing in the doorway, watching. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes had softened. "You're leaving already," he said quietly. "Not a question, a statement. The contract is over," she replied, trying to steady her voice. "You have what you needed. There's no reason for us to stay." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a tone far too casual, he asked, "Would you stay for dinner? One last time." She blinked. "Dinner?" His lips quirked, but the faint tension in his shoulders betrayed him. "It would look suspicious if my wife and son vanished the moment the ink dried." She knew that wasn't the reason. Not really, but she couldn't bring herself to refuse. Dinner was quiet, almost intimate. The vast dining table felt less intimidating now, softened by the warmth of flickering candles and Brian's cheerful chatter. But midway through, Brian's words slowed. His head drooped against his arm. Within minutes, he was fast asleep, the remnants of chocolate mousse still clinging to his lips. Steve rose. Without hesitation, he scooped the boy into his arms, and Karen froze. He carried Brian as though he'd done it 1,000 times. No stiffness, no reluctance, only care. When he laid Brian gently in the guest room bed, tucking the blanket around him, Karen's heart cracked open. She had never seen anything so natural, so right. Later, when Brian's soft breathing filled the room, Karen lingered at the door. Her chest was tight, her hands trembling. She couldn't leave without telling Steve the truth. Her guilt, her fear of him hating her, and her desperate need for honesty collided all at once. But before she could speak, Steve surprised her. He was standing at the window, his back to her. His voice was low, thoughtful. "This house has always been empty, you know. No matter how many rooms, how much luxury, it never felt alive." He turned, his eyes meeting hers with startling vulnerability. Until him, for the first time, it feels like home." Her lips parted, but no sound came. He stepped closer, each word deliberate. "I wish you could stay longer." Her breath caught. She forced herself to ask, "Stay as what, Steve?" The contract was only for a week. For a heartbeat, silence stretched. Then his voice softened. "Perhaps as my family, if you don't mind." Her eyes stung. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. Alarm flickered across his face. Did I say something wrong? And that was it. The moment she couldn't run from. She broke. Her voice trembled. "Steve, there's something I should have told you from the beginning." He stilled, his gaze sharpening. "I didn't come here because I wanted to trick you," she rushed out. "I came because I needed the money, because I thought I could pretend for a week and then walk away." Her chest heaved as she forced the rest. "But years ago, before any of this, there was a night. I was desperate. I needed money for college. You were drunk. You didn't even remember me afterward. But that night," her voice broke, "that night gave me Brian." Steve's face was drained of color. His jaw tightened, but his eyes searched hers, torn between disbelief and dawning recognition. Finally, in a hoarse whisper, he said, "All this time, he was mine?" Flashes of memory hit him. A blurred night, laughter, a fleeting touch he had dismissed as imagination. He swallowed hard, staggering back a step. Karen braced herself for anger, rejection, the fury she knew he was capable of. But instead, he softened. "You raised him alone," Steve said quietly. "You gave him everything I should have. And yet here you are, giving me another chance." Her tears flowed freely now. "I never meant to keep him from you. I didn't know who you were. And by the time I found out, it was too late." Steve closed the distance between them in 2 strides. His hands caught hers, firm but trembling. "I meant what I said earlier," he whispered. "This house only feels alive with you in it. I wanted you as my family even before I knew Brian was mine. Now, more than ever, I don't want this to end." His voice broke, raw with emotion. "Be my wife. Not for a week. Not for appearances. For real. Marry me. And let us build the family we were always meant to be." For a long, aching moment, silence reigned. Then Karen, overwhelmed and tearful, nodded. "Yes." He kissed her then, not with the heat of the gala, not for show, but gently, reverently. Behind them, Brian stirred in his sleep. His small voice, drowsy and innocent, whispered, "Dad?" Steve turned, his eyes glistening. He knelt by the bed, brushing the boy's hair back tenderly. "Yes, son," he murmured. "I'm here." And for the first time, he knew he wasn't lying. Not to himself. Not to them. He had everything he never knew he needed. A family. And this time, he would never let them go.